My traitor parents showed up on my doorstep the second they found out how many zeros were in my bank account. I'm Daniel, 32 years old, and it's been 7 years since I officially ceased to exist for my parents, Mary and George. That's not an exaggeration. 7 years, not a call, not a text, not a visit. Nothing. The last time I saw them, I was 25. I drove home to ask for a $5,000 loan to launch my first, small online project, which was supposed to be my salvation, because with a standard $15 an hour job, I simply couldn't afford rent and food. I remember my father, George, didn't even turn his head away from the TV. My mother, Mary, stood by the kitchen table, shuffling through some receipts. I voiced my request, and the silence that fell was so heavy I could hear the wall clock they bought before I was born ticking. Mary then looked at me with an expression I will never forget. It was a mix of exhaustion, annoyance, and complete indifference. She said they couldn't help because they needed to upgrade their own car, and besides, grown men solve their own problems, Dan. They don't run to mommy for money. There wasn't a hint of regret or sympathy in her voice. They both always lived by the principle of every man for himself. But I, the naive fool, thought there were exceptions for their own son. In that moment, I understood. I realized that to them, I had always been something like an annoying mistake or, at best, a source of expenses. I just turned around and walked out without saying a word. Since then, I changed my number, moved to a different state, and didn't seek contact. They obviously didn't try either. Not once. My small project took off. Not immediately, of course. For the first 2 years, I slept 4 hours a night, ate instant noodles, and worked in a tiny, stuffy cubicle. But then, thanks to enormous luck, sleepless nights, and simple fortune, it started turning a profit. By 30, I became what the news calls a suddenly wealthy entrepreneur. My business developing specialized software for mid-sized businesses became a near monopoly in its niche. I sold a controlling stake to a large corporation and, after paying all the taxes, the amount left in my account had 7 zeros. I won't name the exact figure. I'll just say, now I could buy the car my father wanted to buy without a second thought. And this is where the interesting part begins, or rather, the most despicable part. I moved to a suburb of Los Angeles, to a nice house with a pool that I bought purely because I could afford it, not because I dreamed of it. A couple of years of relatively peaceful living passed. I rarely appeared in the press, leading a quiet, though very affluent, lifestyle. I had even forgotten about my parents, processed the old resentment, and just moved on. And then, 3 weeks ago, Wednesday, I'm sitting in the kitchen, drinking coffee, scrolling through the news. Suddenly, the doorbell rings. Unexpected. I have a security system, all that. I look at the monitor, and my insides turn over. Standing on the doorstep are Mary and George, my mother and father. They looked older, of course, but they were dressed in expensive, clearly new clothes. And the indifference I remembered was gone from their eyes. Instead, there was a subservient smile mixed with some kind of predatory greed. They were standing on my doorstep, even though they never knew my address. I still don't know how they found it, but I have a guess. This was one of those moments when you physically feel everything you once went through returning to hit you in the gut. They stood there, ready to start a performance that, I knew, would be the most disgusting of my life. They hadn't just come to visit. They had come for their piece of the pie, a pie I baked myself without their help. And that was the real dirty shock. I opened the door. And just stood there, letting the air hang thick and uncomfortable between us. Mary, my mother, was the first to move. She rushed forward, not for a hug, but to inspect the entryway. She had this practiced, bright smile, the kind politicians use when they need a vote. Daniel. Oh, darling. Your house is simply marvelous. Look, George, look at the marble. It's everything you deserve, sweetie. Her voice was high, almost frantic, a stark contrast to the flat, dismissive tone I last remembered. George, my father, was slower. He just stood behind her, nodding like a bobblehead, his eyes scanning the space for price tags. The silence was screaming. 7 years of silence. And now this hollow, forced warmth. I didn't invite them in. They just stepped past me, asserting their presence in a space they had no right to occupy. I didn't say welcome. I just said, "How did you get my address?" George finally spoke, but he didn't answer the question. He cleared his throat. "Well, Dan, we heard things. Heard you did well for yourself. A friend of a friend mentioned seeing a piece about you in the local business journal." He avoided my gaze, focused intently on a painting on the wall, probably calculating its cost. This friend of a friend line was their flimsy cover story, and I saw right through it. They didn't read business journals. They read supermarket tabloids. They dug. They smelled money and started digging. We ended up in the living room. I didn't offer them anything, but Mary immediately started the performance. "We've missed you so much, Danny. These last years have been so hard without you. We think about you all the time." My stomach turned. All the time? When I was struggling, when I was completely alone, they were too busy upgrading their car to send one text. I just sat back on the leather sofa, arms crossed, letting them talk. I wanted to see how deep they would dig their own hole. My bitterness felt cold and heavy in my chest, a defensive shield I hadn't realized I needed to rebuild. Then Mary started subtly shifting the conversation. Her smile dimmed a fraction. "You know, dear, since you left, things have been so difficult for us. George's retirement fund. Well, it hasn't recovered from the market dip, not like yours, I'm sure." She sighed theatrically, running a hand over the fabric of my custom-made couch. "And the house needs a new roof. It's leaking, Daniel, right over the dining room table. We're at a point where we might have to sell the place we raised you in." The desperation in her voice was almost convincing, but the timing ruined it completely. They waited for me to become a millionaire, and then they had a leaky roof and a bad retirement fund. Coincidence? I don't think so. I saw the calculated move. They weren't just here to reconnect. They were here to establish a narrative of need. A need that I, the successful son they abandoned, was now morally obligated to fix. I let out a slow breath. "That sounds rough, Mary. What exactly are you hoping to achieve by telling me this?" I asked, my voice flat, deliberately devoid of emotion, like I was discussing a vendor contract. I kept my expression neutral, but inside, I was mapping out my next 3 moves. I wasn't going to give them anything, not a dollar, not an inch of emotional forgiveness. But I wasn't going to kick them out immediately either. I needed to know the full extent of their plan. I needed to watch them squirm, to see them degrade themselves trying to reclaim the son they tossed away. This felt less like a family visit and more like a cruel, high-stakes negotiation. And the clock was ticking. This whole toxic reunion was only 3 weeks old, and I knew I couldn't tolerate this charade for the full month. Mary's face tightened with genuine panic. She shot a quick, worried glance at George, who just fiddled with his cheap wedding ring. They weren't prepared for my coldness. They expected a fatted calf, ready to be enthusiastically welcomed back to the fold. "Well, we just wanted to see you, Dan. We're family. Family helps each other," she finished, the word family, sounding like a cheap, tarnished coin rolling across the floor. That was their first mistake. They invoked the bond they destroyed 7 years ago. I simply nodded, the silence returning, heavy and judgmental this time. I looked at the expensive quartz countertop they had admired on the way in. They didn't deserve a house like this. They didn't deserve a son like me, especially the one I was now. "Family helps each other," Mary had said, the hypocrisy thick enough to choke on. I didn't laugh, though the urge was strong. I just maintained the flat, professional demeanor that I usually reserve for hostile takeover talks. I wasn't going to let them off the hook with vague sentimentality. "Mary, George," I said, leaning forward slightly, making eye contact with George for the first time since they arrived. My voice was low and steady. "I understand you're facing difficulties, but let's be clear. 7 years ago, when I came to you for $5,000, a sum that meant the difference between paying rent and sleeping in my car while I built this business, you looked me in the eye and told me to solve my own problems. You chose a car upgrade over your own son. So, forgive me if the word family rings hollow to me now. Explain to me precisely why your current financial troubles are suddenly my responsibility." The air instantly soured. The performance was over. The conflict was now face to face. Mary's practiced smile melted into genuine fury, the mask slipping away. That's unfair, Daniel. We were just protecting our future. You were young, you could bounce back. We thought you would appreciate the lesson in self-reliance. She practically spat out, her hands gripping the armrests of the sofa. George, who had been silent, finally chimed in, his voice slightly desperate. Your mother is right, Dan. Besides, we're not asking for a handout, not really. We've come up with a proposition. Ah, the proposition. I waited. This was what I needed to hear. I let a long, agonizing silence stretch out, forcing them to feel the weight of my judgment. We need about $200,000, George finally admitted, rushing the words out like he was tearing off a bandage. For the roof, clearing some old debts, and just bringing the retirement fund back up to a manageable level. But we're willing to pay you back. Slowly. We could sign something. I couldn't help the slight, cold smile that touched my lips. 200,000. That's a little more than the 5,000 you decided to invest in your SUV 7 years ago. And you want to sign something? I stood up and walked over to the huge window, looking out at the meticulously landscaped yard, ignoring them completely for a full minute. I was letting the pressure build, using the wealth around me as a deliberate, silent weapon. When I turned back, I had a plan. An ugly, manipulative plan, but one that was necessary to get to the core of their calculated greed. Here's my proposition, I said, my voice hardening. I didn't earn this money to throw it away on people who discarded me. However, I am willing to give you the $200,000 you need, but not as a loan. It will be an investment. Mary looked confused, George looked hopeful. I will buy your house, I explained. I will purchase the house at the current market value, which, considering the leaky roof and the neighborhood, is probably just over $350,000. I'll give you the $200,000 you need now, and the rest, $150,000, will be paid out over the next 3 years, contingent on one thing. I need a personal assistant here in LA. You two will move in here into the guest wing. You, Mary, will manage my domestic staff and calendar. You, George, will handle my finances and run my errands. You will earn the remaining $150,000 by working for me, full-time, for the next 3 years. If you quit or fail to perform, the contract is void, and you lose the remaining amount. Essentially, you become my high-paid servants, completely reliant on me for your income and housing. The look on their faces was priceless. The sheer, brutal shock of being confronted by their own actions, now leveraged against them, was devastating. The son they rejected was now offering them salvation, but at the cost of their freedom and pride. Mary started hyperventilating slightly, and George looked like he had been slapped. The tension was now a physical thing, suffocating the room. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about power, control, and a harsh, cold form of justice delivered in the space of 3 weeks since their arrival. They had come for a bailout, and I had offered them indentured servitude. The silence was deafening. The silence that followed my proposition was the most satisfying silence I had experienced in 7 years. It was the sound of two people realizing the full, terrible cost of their past choices. Mary was the first to regain her composure, though her face was still pale. She shot a look at George, a look that was calculating and desperate, clearly urging him to accept. Pride was fighting a losing battle against the leaky roof and the empty retirement fund. Daniel, that is harsh, Mary finally whispered, her voice stripped of its earlier artificial charm. We would be working for you in your house, after all these years. After all these years of nothing, I interjected, keeping my tone perfectly even. You came here expecting me to simply hand over $200,000 as a gesture of filial devotion that you never earned. I am offering you a business contract. You get the immediate capital you need, you sell an asset you are struggling to maintain, and you earn the rest through honest work. It's an objectively fair deal, given the circumstances. You'll be well compensated, better than most assistants. But yes, you will be working for me. My house, my rules, my schedule. George pushed himself up from the sofa, walked over to the bay window, and just stared out at the pool. He didn't speak for a long time. I watched him, noticing the defeat etched into his posture. This wasn't the proud, dismissive father who had watched TV instead of listening to his son 7 years ago. This was a broken man, brought low by poor planning and, more importantly, by his own moral failings. "What exactly does running my errands entail, Daniel?" George asked, his voice low and shaky. He was already negotiating the terms of his servitude. "Everything?" I replied, feeling a genuine coldness inside me. "If I need a dozen specialized screws from a hardware store 30 miles away at 10 p.m., you go. If I need a detailed market analysis by 6 a.m., you do it. Mary will handle my social calendar, manage the housekeeping staff, and screen all my non-business calls. You are both on call 24/7 with reasonable allowance for sleep, of course. But you are here to make my life run smoothly. You will be compensated, but you will be mine for 3 years." Mary stepped in, her eyes shining with sudden, panicked calculation. "And the house? You'd take ownership immediately? We would be tenants. Employees in our own son's house?" "It will be my house," I confirmed. "And you will be my employees living in the guest wing. That $200,000 transfer is contingent on signing the deed over to me and the employment contract. I've already prepared the paperwork. I just need to call my lawyer, Ethan, to finalize the specifics." I hadn't prepared anything, but I needed to show them I was serious and fast-moving. This whole confrontation had lasted only 3 days since they showed up on my porch, and the intensity was already through the roof. George finally turned around. He looked directly at me, and I saw a flash of the old, arrogant contempt buried deep beneath the desperation. But he suppressed it. He had no leverage. "And if we say no? If we decide we'd rather struggle than take this arrangement?" This was the pivotal moment, the major plot twist for them. I paused, letting the silence hang once more. "Then you walk away with nothing," I stated simply. "And I go back to my life knowing I gave you a chance to fix your situation, a chance you chose to decline. You will never hear from me again, and you will certainly never get $1 from me. You made your choice 7 years ago. I am making mine now." Mary's shoulders slumped. She looked at George, and her decision was clear. "We accept, Daniel," she said, defeated. George didn't argue. He just gave a curt, stiff nod. They had chosen financial survival and humiliation over pride. The son they abandoned was now their boss, their landlord, and their only lifeline. The papers would be signed tomorrow. The next chapter of our toxic family relationship was about to begin, and it would be played out entirely on my turf. The paperwork was signed the next day. 3 weeks and 1 day after they showed up on my porch, Mary and George transferred the deed to their old house to me and signed the employment contract. The $200,000 hit their account immediately. I watched the transaction go through, feeling absolutely nothing. No joy, no vengeance, just a cold sense of finality. They were now financially secure, but entirely shackled to me. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. They moved into the guest wing later that week. Their presence was a constant, low-level irritant, like background noise you can't quite tune out. They tried to maintain a semblance of parental authority, but every time they attempted a casual, "How was your day, Dan?" I would immediately counter with a work order. My first truly demeaning task came on Friday. I was having an important dinner with 2 investors, Ethan and Charlotte. Mary, as the designated house manager, had meticulously overseen the catering and table setting. Everything was perfect. Just as we were about to start the main course, I looked over at George, who was hovering nervously near the kitchen entrance. "George," I said, my voice carrying just enough to be heard over the polite dinner chatter. "I need that specialized printer ink for the main office. The cartridge is running low, and I have a huge contract printing tonight. It's the X300 model. Only the Office Max in Santa Monica has it in stock. That's about an hour's drive one way. Take my Tesla. Make sure you bring the receipt. I need it back in 40 minutes maximum. That gives you 20 minutes for the round trip after driving time. Go." George's face went white. Santa Monica at 8 p.m. on a Friday was impossible in 40 minutes. It was a 3-hour task minimum in that traffic. Daniel, that's not possible, George stammered, appealing to me not as an employee, but as a son. The traffic alone. I cut him off, smiling warmly at my investors before turning my gaze back to him, cold and hard. You signed the contract, George. Says run errands as required. This is required. If you can't manage the simple task, then perhaps you aren't the right fit for the role. And if you fail to perform, we both know the consequences for the remaining $150,000. Ethan and Charlotte looked uncomfortable, but I knew they had seen far worse displays of power. George looked down, defeated. He grabbed the keys from the valet stand and rushed out the door. Mary, standing by the kitchen, looked like she was about to cry, but she held it in. She couldn't afford a scene. She smiled professionally at me and continued pouring water for my guests. I had successfully degraded my father in front of strangers and forced my mother to serve them. The cost of their betrayal was being paid in full with their dignity. The final 2 weeks were a blur of increasingly ridiculous demands. I had Mary stay up until 3 a.m. reorganizing my sock drawer alphabetically and by fabric type. I had George wash my car in the middle of a thunderstorm, just because I told him to. They were exhausted, humiliated, and silent. They performed their duties flawlessly, driven by the fear of losing the remaining capital. The most emotional moment came last Saturday. I found Mary crying quietly in the guest bathroom. When she saw me, she quickly wiped her eyes and tried to put on her work face. "Are you happy, Daniel?" she whispered, her voice rough. "Does this make up for what we did? Seeing us like this?" I looked at her, and for the first time I allowed myself to be honest, not just manipulative. "It doesn't make me happy, Mary, because happiness would mean I had parents who genuinely cared about me, not just my bank account. What this does is give me peace. Peace knowing that the people who taught me the hardest lesson in life, that family ties mean nothing without respect, are now being forced to live by my rules. You wanted me to solve my own problems. I did. Now you have to solve yours by working for me." She didn't argue. She just nodded, picked up her dust cloth, and went back to work. A month had passed. They had settled into their roles, my indispensable, miserable servants. I had my revenge, my justice, and my $350,000 house. But as I sat alone in my huge house that evening, looking out at the city lights, the peace I thought I had gained felt hollow. I was a millionaire with perfect organization, but the bitter resentment hadn't left me. I had successfully proven that they were motivated purely by money, but in doing so, I had also proven that money had the power to dictate every single relationship in my life, including the most fundamental one. I had won the battle for control, but the war for my soul, the part that still craved unconditional love, was lost the day they chose the car over me. And now I was left wondering, was I any less cold and calculating than they were, just because my cruelty came with a contract?